Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Sierra Club Wednesday night community conversation. Tonight, we're focused on soil health, healthy soils. What's that gonna look like in Vermont over the next few decades? I'm Steve Crowley. I'll be playing host here tonight, and the rest of our production team includes Rob Kidd, who's our chapter staff person, who's going to man the controls, and Jack Cushman, who's the third part of our team. And we have two great speakers tonight. We have Dee Dee Purshouse and we have Grace Gershuni. And there you have their affiliations there. And we are going to start tonight. Oh, I should mention, Kat Buxton had planned to be here tonight, but she had some family concerns and was unable to join us. So we have Grace and Gershuni, Grace and Dee Dee. So, and we begin with Grace. So Grace, take it away.
So thank you for the invitation. And I am going to just give you a little bit of what my background is and some of my story. So the main credential that you've had from me is that I'm on the board of the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition, and I am the author of at least one book, which is this, Organic Revolutionary, a memoir of the movement for real food, planetary healing, and human liberation. And I've written a few other books, and the one that's probably my proudest achievement is called The Soul of Soil, and it is a guide to ecological soil management that was first published in 1983 and is now in its fourth edition from Chelsea Green, and still sending me royalties. So that's the primary way that got me involved in the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition. The reason I wrote Organic Revolutionary has to do with my long career that took me from being a grassroots organic farming advocate and an organic farmer and a teacher to be involved in the world of organic certification, starting in the 70s, actually, working with NOFA, and then eventually becoming involved in national organizing around organic standards, and eventually getting recruited to come to Washington to help USDA write the National Organic Program standards. And so I'm sure that there are many people who have strange ideas about how that came about, but I ended up having to write this book as a memoir to try to tell the story in a personal way and to set the record straight on some of the strange misconceptions that people have about the whole process. And a lot of the context for this has to do with my involvement in the Institute for Social Ecology, which some of you may be familiar with, of which I'm also on the board, and in which context I did a lot of teaching about agriculture and food systems, and spent a lot of time listening to and studying the co-founder of the Institute, Murray Bookchin. And so all of this was put into the mix of why I had to write this memoir. And the reason that I've really persisted in and continuing to publish and promote it, although this third edition actually of the book was published by Black Rose Books in Montreal. We had a book launch on March 12th in Montreal, 2 days before the border was closed for the pandemic. So there hasn't been too much promotion going on. So the reason, though, that I'm really pushing the book is because I really believe that the solutions to climate change are under our feet and through our food system. And the solutions to climate change, as well as all of the interrelated kinds of issues that we're facing now, including the pandemic, are related very much to our food system. And people are waking up to the fragility of our food system and the globalized long supply chains that it involves. So the social, economic, and political repercussions of food system change are really part and parcel of why I got involved with the organic movement and with social ecology and the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition more recently. And Dee Dee can probably tell you a little bit more about the history of how it started, but I certainly want to give a shout out to Kat Buxton, who has been really the prime motivator, energizer, and envisioner of what this organization is. And the real crux of what the organization does is educational and connecting people who understand the importance of healthy soil to each other, whatever their walk of life or political persuasion or pursuit or enterprise. And so we concentrate on things like building the social mycelium that connects the health of the soil to the health of the plants and the animals and the people, and on to the health of communities and the entire planetary ecosystem. And so that's why the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition is so important to the survival of human civilization and the possibility of restoring thriving, healthy communities amidst the upheavals that we're facing now. So how we grow our food and care for the land and each other is related to all of these interrelated crises. And I want to give a particular shout out to an article that was posted by Sierra Club's Hopkins in June, actually, called Racism is Killing the Planet. And a great deal of this work involves becoming much more aware of the destructive capitalism and white supremacy that are part and parcel of each other, that are really what's killing the planet. And the article says things like, we'll never stop climate change without ending white supremacy. And I think that that is a very true statement. And the other statement that is highlighted in the article is, you can't have climate change without sacrifice zones. You can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people. And you can't have disposable people without racism. And I think I'll end my commentary there. Just kind of wanted to give a sense of where I'm coming from and what's motivating me to continue wanting to have these conversations. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Grace. Dee Dee, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I fell in love with soil, and really more specifically what I call the soil sponge, soon after Hurricane Irene. And I suspect everyone here lived through, we called it a tropical storm here in Vermont. But and I really wasn't thinking a whole lot about climate change at that point. I was very focused on resilience and on the transition town movement and on our healthcare system. I was writing a book. I was in about my 7th year out of 9, writing a book called The Ecology of Care. And the subtitle is Medicine, Agriculture, Money, and the Quiet Power of Human and Microbial Communities. Which started off as a book really about sustainability and healthcare. And I was writing it from a holistic healthcare perspective, but really looking at how unresilient our healthcare system is. So I was thinking about all the same questions, but I felt like here we are in Vermont, if it gets a little warmer, so we'll get to grow a little more food. It's just very, very narrow view. And I was thinking about climate change in terms of just warming. And then right after, as Tropical Storm Irene hit, I suddenly experienced how we're experiencing climate change, which is really about water, and very much about soil, so that interaction of soil and water, which over the next 6 months or so after that, I started really, really digging in deep and trying to understand those connections, and realized that basically everywhere I drove after that, I was looking at these stream beds, right? That all of our dirt roads in Vermont are built along what were old deer paths that became horse paths, that then became horse and buggy paths, and then eventually roads. And everywhere I drove, I just kept thinking, what's going to happen during the next big rain? And one of the things that I noticed was that where there was vegetation, the soil was intact, and where there was no vegetation, the roads and the soil had eroded. And that was kind of lesson number 1, is that vegetation builds a sponge. So whether it's trees or grass, etc., it creates the fibrous network underground, but also I've learned since then, soil aggregation. So it's not just the roots and the fungal hyphae that are creating kind of the rebar under there, but it's also all of the clumps of soil that leave little space between them. And I didn't really have language for that at that point, but I was fascinated by this interaction of soil and water and flooding. And as I started piecing together the pieces and realizing, oh, as I'm writing about our healthcare system's resilience, we got to include this in here. This is a big piece. And also, so started reading about climate change in general, and people started getting asked to speak about climate change and its effect on public health, and on the healthcare system in general. But the flip side of that was looking at carbon and carbon drawdown. And I came across a little book by Judith Schwartz, who I think you had her on already. Yes? Did you have Judy Schwartz on? Oh, no. Okay. Another Vermont author who wrote a book called Cows Save the Planet. And I saw this at the Norwich bookstore and thought, what's this? And it was about soil. And the book I was writing already had a theme around cows, because I was writing about a patient of mine who was a grass farmer, and he was one example in the book, and but couldn't quite tie all these pieces together. That my editors were saying, this book is about everything. I was like, it is about everything. It's all connected. And when I finally understood soil's central role in nutrition, in climate change, in the carbon cycle, in the water cycle, in local resilience, in obviously in food production, in flooding and drought, etc., I realized, okay, this is actually the center of this book that I've been working on for so many years. This is how I tie it all together. So back to the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition. My stories always go all over the place because everything is connected. A couple of years after that was developing curriculum around soil health and watershed function. My first book had come out, and I was working in local schools, and we kind of come up with simple ways to explain how soil is so central. And one that I came up with was a plate of flour for degraded soil and a plate with some slices of bread piled on top of each other for a healthy soil sponge, and then poke some holes in a Dixie cup and have a little rainstorm over each one and see what happens. And it all is very clear there. You see the erosion with the flour. You see that it's not soaking in, it's just beating up and rolling off the top. So nothing's getting down to the plant roots. You see the drought right after that because the water has left the landscape. And so you have both flooding and drought. And I had my students present this at a conference on water down at Tufts. And this scientist from Australia came up to me afterwards and was talking about the soil sponge. So we had the image, I had the concept, but I didn't have that word. And his name was Walter Jena. He and I became friends, and the next year, I invited him back to the States to put on a conference together at Lake Maury Resort. And I believe, Grace, were you there for that first one? No? Okay, well, Kat was there for the first one, Kat Buxton. And we had a really wonderful, deep conversation for a number of days. And when I put on a conference, I like to have a single speaker or 2 or 3 speakers, but no more, go really deep. And that particular group was the inspiration for Kat to start the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition. So that it kind of grew out of a conversation that came out of that workshop of like, what are we going to do with all this great information? And so we got it started. It was very much Kat behind it, getting it all organized, getting the website up and running. And since then, there have been 2 years of a soil series, not unlike this, looking at a series of conversations on evenings, various evenings throughout a season, and looking at soil's central role in so many different parts of life on the planet. So I've gone on to work right now. My most recent work is working on a project with the UN in India that has about 800,000 farmers practicing soil health and local resilience in a very profound way that's being taken up by the whole country of India. So I was there this fall to help them develop training manuals and working with the same scientist, consulting with government officials, et cetera, and working on a lot of other projects as well, but I'll stop there. So.
Okay, terrific. Well, thanks so much. I think that it looks like some people have been posting some questions here. So why don't we start with Rachel's question for Grace. What can individuals do to join the organic revolution is eating enough, or what else do people, what constitutes joining the organic revolution?
Well, there's certainly eating organic is a good place to start. Learning to grow your own food is even better, and really educating yourself about what's involved in the food you eat and the food system, and then sharing that information with others. That's where the revolution builds. And you don't have to be against anything. I tend to be more of a what are you for kind of person. So there's just as many different things that you can do depending on what your real passions are in life. If you're an educator, well, you can work with your students to help them understand the importance of what they eat and where it comes from and how it's grown. Those are just some examples, but it's mostly changing our paradigms about food and health and the relationship to the rest of society, really, and on and on, understanding how whole systems work. These are all aspects of becoming organic revolutionaries. Thank you for the question.
Great, thanks. I see that Scott and Michaela wrote in a couple of questions. I think what I'd like to do there is bunch the second one with Susan's question in a second. But the first question is, Dee Dee, do we have a similar question, a question similar to Rachel's? What can individuals who are not farmers do to improve the quality of our soils beyond composting? And I guess I would just ask, since we really haven't heard that yet tonight, how about farmers, and what can farmers do? What's the difference between what farmers are doing now and what we might be able to do in Vermont? Or is that something we really know about so far?
Actually, we know quite a lot about that, and the soil health movement in the which really has started in the Midwest, is a little bit different than the soil carbon movement that has been more on the coasts, and the soil health principles that they've come up with in the soil health movement are basically principles rather than specific practices for thinking about how does nature grow food, is the way that I explain it in this Understanding Soil Health and Watershed Function. So one is diversity is really key, and it's not enough to rotate crops. You really need diversity growing all in one space. So even in a lawn or in a field, to make sure that you are that you're aiming for more diversity. There's something that happens in terms of the microbiology and in terms of the system of who's getting attracted to that land, and the microbes that come in the, with bird poop and insects and pollinators and everything else, as well as the equivalent that's happening underground, who's getting attracted to those sugars that the plants are feeding out through their root system, in terms of different insects underground, but also microbes and different fungal organisms. So diversity is really, really key. A second one is not disturbing the soil unnecessarily. So it is possible to grow food without tilling the soil, and it's certainly possible to grow a lawn or a hay field, though there are people who, even growing hay, are tilling the soil and then replanting it, which is a really poor idea if you want to have any soil left. So disturbing the soil as little as possible, and keeping living roots in the ground 365 days a year, or in Vermont, they're not necessarily living all the time, but the more perennials we can grow, the better in terms of having actual active life happening underground year round. And grasses and things like that will actually continue to photosynthesize under the snow if it's not too heavy of a snowpack. You've probably seen that as snow melts and there's green right under there. Let's see, what am I missing? There's diversity, not too much disturbance, or as little disturbance as possible. Grace, I'm blanking out here.
Well, slow and spread the
water. Let's
water.
see. I have a whole other version of it.
And keeping the surface covered.
There we go. Okay, yep. So, and in some ways, these are all related, right? Because if you have living roots in the ground, etc. But even if you have bare soil, you want to keep it covered, because the impact of rain is actually quite violent, and wind on bare soil. So even if you're not growing anything somewhere, to make sure that there's a layer of mulch, a layer of hay, or something on top of it until you do get something growing there is really key. And then there's a fifth one that isn't part of the kind of official list that the NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, puts out, but is very much part of the soil health movement, which is to integrate animals into your land management, which means planting things that invite pollinators and birds and attract wildlife, etc., but also including grazing. So for example, in Vermont, we have a lot of hay fields, and if you're just cutting and removing the organic matter, you're really like mining that piece of land, taking everything away without putting anything back. Whereas if every year or two you were to graze it, you would be bringing nutrients back onto the field rather than having to truck them back. I mean, spreading manures, better than nothing, but it's it's not a bad thing at all, but actually having the animal impact is a little bit different than just spreading the manure. There's things that happen in the saliva of grazing animals. There's a lot of interesting interactions when you bring grazing animals in. So even with cover crops, not just a hay field, but even, obviously a grazing system has grazing animals in it, but even with the cover crops or like corn stalks or things like that, you can actually graze those down. And it's, of course, a much better use of space as well.
And that would be the basis for Judy Schwartz's book, Cows Save the Planet.
Yes, and there's a lot more to that it's incredible what they're doing. I don't know if people have seen Alan Savory's TED Talk. It's worth, I'm going to try to find some links here for you. I will post in the chat while you do the next question. So.
Okay, well, Jack, maybe we could go to you for a minute. There are a couple more questions we'll come back to.
Sure.
Go ahead, Jack.
Thank you, Grace and Dee Dee. This is very interesting. I'd like to play off a couple of comments that each of you made. One, when Grace said the solutions to climate change are under our feet and in our food systems. And Dee Dee, your mention of how conventional agriculture is almost like mining the soil, an extractive industry. And these comments reminded me of the findings of some work that I was involved in as a journalist. I'm going to dump this into the chat box if people would, after our discussion, be interested in reading this piece, which was called Harvesting Peril. It's a rather long series. But what jumped out at our journalistic team as we worked on this, and it wasn't a conclusion that we went in with, was that there were big links that very few people think about between the fossil fuel industry and large-scale conventional agriculture. both in the fertilizer business and the use of fossil fuels, and among those links was their political alliance in denying the science of climate change, which we found spelled out in a lot of detail. And I wanted to ask you, since much of what you're recommending has been understood at the working level of agriculture for a long time, at least innately, why has it been so hard to change? And what do you find are the sources of resistance to bringing about the kind of change that you're looking for? Thank you.
Well,
Wow.
or did you have someone in mind, or you for that question?
I certainly have some
Yeah,
comments.
I'm sure we both have plenty to
Let's
say.
hear from both of
Go
you.
for it, Grace.
Okay, well, you know, the connection between the fossil fuel industry and industrial agribusiness is a very direct one, and it has to do with all of the inputs that are used in industrial agriculture, whether it's pesticides, herbicides, other biocides that are all derived from petrochemicals, or even more importantly, from the standpoint of climate change, the production of synthetic nitrates. And synthetic nitrates were first developed during just before World War I through a process known as the Haber-Bosch process, developed by Germans for the purpose of providing feedstock to make munitions. The nitrogen had to be fixed from the air and turned into ammonia through a very, very energy intensive process that is now a huge worldwide industry that consumes something like between 3 and 5% of all of the natural gas usage on the planet. And this, by the way, is a process that is done in nature by microbial symbionts with plants in the soil and with blue-green algae in the water. So that and the synthetic nitrogen not only makes crops grow really fast, their nutritional value is decreased as a result, and the impact on the soil of the harsh acidifying nitrate fertilizer is to really destroy the soil life that is what feeds the plants, and build and destroys the humus, and the carbon goes away as well. And so beyond that, the nitrate, the excess nitrate, especially if it is left on the surface, it volatilizes, meaning that it dissipates into the atmosphere, forming nitrous oxide, which is a gas that is 317 times as potent a greenhouse forcer as carbon dioxide. And it is a significant contributor to the climate crisis. Not to mention the pollution of water. Many towns, especially in Iowa, where huge amounts of synthetic nitrate are used to grow corn, have really dangerous public water supplies because of nitrate pollution. So I could go on, but that's just one example of the insidious interrelationship. What makes it so difficult to change? It's profitable, and the corruption of the system that we have now must be so glaringly obvious to all of us that I don't think I need to say anything more about that.
Edie?
Go ahead, Dee Dee.
I'm actually going to shift it. I think Grace covered a lot of it, and I agree that really, you know, it's kind of like a follow the money kind of thing. But also, we're very enamored of technology, and we have been for, you know, ever since whenever something new comes along, we want to try figuring out how to use it, and that's a very different approach than figuring out how to collaborate with other parts of this living system or other living systems. And we're really not brought up anymore to think that way about collaborating with living systems or think of ourselves as being nested within many living systems. So as soon as we start thinking that way, it becomes almost impossible to rely on biocides or to bring in a chemical to make a plant grow. It's very obvious that you are messing with the system. And I think a lot of us had this experience during the shutdown, you know, as things were shutting down, and everything in life has been so weird over the last few months. But as spring came out, it was like, well, everything is shut down, but the plants are coming up, the flowers, you know, the first crocuses, the daffodils, etc. And I know for me, even though this is my work, there was a real sense of awe of like, these guys really know what they're doing, these plants. they're going to do their thing. And really, we need to be very careful about interfering with that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the flip side of this in terms of fossil fuels and climate change, which is that there's a lot of talk about soil carbon, so plants photosynthesizing, taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, building themselves, growing themselves, and then essentially feeding everything. So feeding everything above and below ground, either directly or indirectly. And part of that feeding is feeding microbes underground that then are holding carbon. So soil carbon is the living and the dead and the very dead. Right? It's not just a thing on the periodic table. Like we're all sequestering carbon for, you know, 50 to 100 years in our bodies, right? And plants are doing that, and anything that's alive is doing that. It's not some mysterious process. We're in the midst of it. And part of how it gets, the way it gets to us is through plants that we eat, or that we eat animals that have eaten plants. So there's the whole carbon cycle, and the fact that the more plants that we grow and the more life that we allow to stay underground, we are sequestering carbon. But there's a whole other piece to climate change going on, which is that as plants are growing and photosynthesizing, they are also transpiring water. And the air around plants, not just from the shade, which is another whole piece, but the air around a plant is cooler. The leaf of a plant is much cooler than a piece of green paper in that same sun. Much cooler, like 20, 30, 40 degrees cooler, that leaf, depending on how hot it is out. And I experienced this in India, where it was very hot. We were in southern India, and we were sitting under the shade having a talk, and then we went out into the field where we were in the sunshine, but in plants that are about the same height as we were, and it was so much cooler to be in the sun but among the plants than under a tent in the shade. So we can provide, at the very least, we can provide significant regional cooling, much more cooling than we need in terms of cooling the climate, by making sure that there are no bare soils. But according to Walter Jena, Grace's and my colleague in Australia, we can actually cool the entire planet through transpiration, and that is maybe actually a big piece of why the temperature is going up, is because there's so much bare soil because of industrial agriculture. So the fact that we have machines that can just knock everything down means we have these massive bare expanses.
And also urban concrete impervious surfaces, the huge amount of
Absolutely,
that.
yeah. So just imagine, you know, you're on the street on black pavement, right, with your bare feet, and there's grass right next to you. Where are you going to jump to? If you've got bare feet, you're going to jump onto the grass, and that's because of this transpiration, and because of the shading that's happening of the soil under the grass, and because of the lack of re-radiation. Like a black surface re-radiates much more heat than something that's green. So there's a huge potential for cooling, even if you take carbon out of the equation. And then if you add the carbon in, we're golden. Sorry, Steve, it looks like you're trying to talk, but you're muted.
There we go. Yeah, I was just reading last week an article about green spaces in cities and urban heat islands, and the distinction in the socioeconomic connections with that. And I even thought about how Burlington is right up the street from me. If you drive around town, the green parts of town are the ones with the more expensive homes, and the Old North End there is the part of Burlington that's really decidedly not so green, and that's definitely the lower rents and houses closer together.
And
you're
you know,
looking for the
brings us back. It actually brings us right back to the social justice question that Grace started with, which I was at a meeting with the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation trying to figure out about the connection with soils and cities, and we were talking about this, you know, greening neighborhoods, and there were people there who that was their full-time work, and they said that they actually had a lot of pushback from people in the lower income neighborhoods, because they had seen that if you plant a lot of trees, suddenly the property values go up so high and the property taxes go up, and then the landlords kick out the renters and say, hey, I can sell this for more money. So we actually have to really think about redlining and social justice, gentrification, affordability while we do this.
Interesting. Well, we have a few questions here that connect some policy issues, and I'm gonna run through them and then see if you can address sort of how does this hit the ground in terms of policy. So one question from Scott and Michaela again is, are there policy or legislative issues that make you particularly concerned? Susan Kaplan has a question about carbon sequestration, which is one of those hot topics in the legislature these days. And how would you think of soils and trees and the sequestration concept in terms of something like meeting our carbon goals? And Rob raised a question about organic standards, and so what are your thoughts about those? Where do you see the opportunities for your work in legislative or other policy issues?
Well, we've certainly been involved with some legislative and policy issues, primarily through collaboration with our coalition partners, such as Rural Vermont, which really has a very strong legislative presence. Kat and I believe Dee Dee are both on the Payment for Ecosystem Services Working Group, which was set up through the legislature. And Kat also serves as a staff person for the 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 composting working group, which I don't think is a legislative initiative, but it is looking at, maybe it is, I'm not sure, but it's also another piece of the food cycle in which, of course, now that the mandate to prevent any organic waste materials from going into landfills is in effect, the need for more opportunities for small composting operations has become critical. And so that's one of the, that's another one of the ways that closing the loop on the waste stream and getting that material returned to the soil instead of polluting the landfills and the water is a key strategy. But the payment for ecosystem services concept is one that's been kicking around a lot in Europe. Actually, there are systems in place to support payment for ecosystem services for conversion to organic agriculture because of the benefits ecologically in terms of clean water, soil health, and carbon sequestration among them that are proven to be conferred by organic systems. I do want to address the question I think I saw earlier, and I can't find it now, that was asking me about the recent introduction of a bill for a regenerative agriculture certification in the legislature, which I actually was quite horrified by, to tell you the truth. And there's a long, complicated story behind why that horrified me so much. Much of it having to do with what, it took us 40 years to get organic certification to be understood and accepted and mainstreamed and become, organic foods comprise at this point about 5% of the food system, and organic land under organic management is somewhat more than 1% of US farmland at this point. So despite the huge growth of the organic industry, we're still a tiny segment of the food system and the land management, and that's got to change. And the regenerative movement is extremely important because organic isn't enough. And we've learned a lot more about the damage that can be done by tillage, which is permitted in organic standards. And yet the idea of a better than organic standard is a bit, it just isn't the right way to go. The marketplace has some value in educating people about the need for changing the food system, but when you start cluttering it up with all kinds of competing, ours is stricter than yours, and yours is not quite good enough, et cetera, it completely confuses and lets the air out of the ability of the public to care about that system. So in my opinion, it is very counterproductive to start competing organic and denigrating organic in the process.
Dee Dee, do you have any perspectives on that whole question?
Yeah, I actually testified at the State House on this when they were thinking about that standard, and they brought me in to hear what I thought, and I said similarly to Grace, but for slightly different reasons, that for me, that one of the issues was that they're pitting farmers against each other. Like this is a bad farmer, this is an okay farmer, this is a good farmer, this is a great farmer. And I think what we're really aiming for is a movement where we are getting people to understand living systems and everybody take a step forward towards a common shared aim. And whether that step is a baby step or a giant step, the important thing is that we're moving in that direction, and that the farmers and the consumers need to move together as one herd, really. And not everybody can afford to move at the same speed. It doesn't necessarily make sense in certain places to move too quickly or whatever. People have a lot of investment in things like manure pits, et cetera, that the state already told them to do, and that they can't get their money back unless we change some legislation somewhere. And we are really missing some key pieces of a fully functioning food system, like more local slaughterhouses, more food hubs and food production places where small businesses can thrive. There are lots and lots of things that we can do that will make it much easier for everybody to do something regenerative. And regenerative is a word that there is no definition of regenerative. It's not a set of practices. It is a viewpoint that you have to recreate every time you think about something, because it's very easy for us to fall back into, if you think about like 4 levels, the basic level that most of our society's been operating in is like extracting value from the landscape, from other people, from the market, etc. And then a lot of organizations came along and pushed back, and with a mindset of like stopping the disorder, stop the destruction. So, you know, save the whales, etc., and doing very good work, but it was head to head with that extractive mindset. And so it became a pushing, shoving fight. And then lots and lots of great people have come forward with a lot of money to do good and sort of do the right thing. But there's a level beyond that, which is to regenerate living systems and do good. The problem with do good is because my idea of what's good is different than your idea of what's good, right? And then you get competing funding streams. And a lot of the money in those foundations comes from extract value systems. So we're really not going to get there until we commit ourselves to every day trying to understand living systems. It's not like you can get certified in it. You can't get certified in regenerative farming because regenerative farming is a learning process every day.
There is a regenerative organic agriculture standard out there that is certifying people.
Oh, I know, but I'm saying someone can say I'm doing this certification thing, and I'm not going to fight against it. But I'm saying my perspective is that there isn't a day in which you suddenly go from not understanding to understanding, or not practicing it to practicing it, because we are always going to be learning more.
Yeah.
And the standards are always going to be looking back. There's best practices can only reflect what was known at the time that those practices were put into place. So they're always going to be
exactly
out of date.
I have a great deal of reflection on the shortcomings of standardizing anything in my book. I hope people will be enticed to check it out.
And I wanted to just say a little bit more about the Payment for Ecosystem Services Working Group in Vermont, which was a really exciting very, very interesting group of people coming together over many, many months to put together our first report. And then we got a little bit hung up by the pandemic, but we will be continuing. And what was very different about Vermont's approach to it than other states or other countries is most other places were thinking about payment for a single thing, like paying for soil carbon sequestration, or paying for reducing, algae blooms, or phosphorus or nitrogen levels. Not even reducing the algae bloom, but reducing a particular chemical in the water. And what everybody on this working group was pretty much in agreement with is that that we wanted to do something that was much more whole, looking at the whole, and much less practice-based and more outcome-based. So paying for, Abe Collins, who was somewhat the inspiration behind the working group, his phrase is hiring Vermont farmers to grow a deep topsoil future. So thinking about this is not it's not a handout. It's not a payment program for a specific thing. It's really like, I want to build a house. I'm going to hire this crew of people to do it. I want to build a healthy landscape. I want to grow a healthy landscape. We're going to hire you to do that as a contractor, like as a water contractor or soil contractor. So with the understanding that if you can grow that soil sponge, there are hundreds of co-benefits, including human health and immunity, that the food that comes out of those systems is going to create a more resilient group, more resilient population in Vermont, people who can think better, whose immune systems respond better to pandemics, et cetera. So, and I think our numbers here in Vermont, our COVID numbers, are in some part a reflection of the fact that we already have a thriving local food system more than many other places. So.
Yeah, one thing that I would throw into the mix, that's all really interesting. As this Global Warming Solutions Act is moving through, it sets up a kind of a 30-year planning process to think about and respond to issues and opportunities related to climate and resiliency and so on. And one of the important subcommittees that gets set up is about food, agriculture, and ecosystems. And it did not draw a lot of interest from agricultural interests, except maybe the Farm Bureau. But the concept is really perfect for blending in the ecosystem services concept and everything else you're talking about. I think once that bill gets set up, within the next couple of months, they will set up those teams. So it might be worth you folks paying attention to that, because that's going to be an ongoing mechanism that will make recommendations and be the starting point for, writing plans and revising laws and setting up funding systems.
That's exactly the way I was thinking about it, Steve. Thank you for raising that, because I actually went to one of the public information meetings and with the question about whether the money that came in from the system could only be used to reduce fuel usage, or if it could be used for any other means of attacking climate change. And the example I used was the substitution of compost for synthetic nitrate fertilizers and subsidizing compost production to make it financially viable for farmers to use that instead of synthetic nitrate. And the guy, was, oh, well, that sounds like it could be a way to do it. And so that's kind of one of my pet ideas that I have brought up in different contexts and over the years. I was at one time also on the board of the Highfield Center for Composting in Hardwick, which was instrumental in getting I forget what the number of the act is that was passed that bans organics from landfills, but that was one of the ideas that I thought would improve the viability of the organization, but the viability of the organization was not up to snuff, so it doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. Anyway.
We're going to move towards our official closing shortly, but we usually stick around for a little while afterwards. So as long as our presenters are willing to hang around, we'll be here for another 20 minutes or so if people are interested. But before we do that, I do want to go to Suzanne, who posted a question. Suzanne, do you want to voice that question yourself, or do you want, I think to sum it up, I think her question's in chat. Suzanne, go ahead.
Hi.
Welcome.
Yeah, sorry, I've been cleaning as I'm listening. So my
Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. My question is, okay, so completely agree with how food is perfectly fine in its natural state. But basically, how do we change people's perception about what food looks like? Like, I grew up in an apple orchard, so I know apples and pears grow extremely similarly. So a scabby apple is just fine. You can eat the scab or you can cut it off. But nobody wants a small, like a natural apple is small and scabby. Nobody wants to eat that. A natural orange is small and is not really quite that bright orange. Celery, like natural celery, is skinny. So how do we change people's perception about what food looks like and it's still delicious and edible and not pristine perfect, because what is growing today is not really the natural state.
I'll just say that I think one of the ways of doing that is having a really active school garden in every school. And if Kat were here, I would love for her to talk about this. Kat is just an absolute master at that. And the Thetford Elementary School, where she's been doing a school garden, has been going for many, many years. And students there have a much broader palette for trying new things and being willing to try something that doesn't look the way that it looks when they buy it at the grocery store. And I think it really is a matter of unfamiliarity and saying, oh, wow, this tastes really good, you know? So getting someone to take one bite. I remember the first time that I ate an organic banana in my probably 20s or 30s, and I thought, that's what bananas used to taste like when I was really little, you know? And I had sort of forgotten what bananas tasted like. So I also wanted to just quickly point people to the Sierra Club in Iowa just posted a really nice long report about not just soil health, but really whole systems around agriculture, and worth taking a look at. So there's a short article and then there's the longer PDF that I put both of those in the chat.
Rob, do you want to put up that screen and address what's coming up?
Yeah, actually, yep. But also, I just want to personally thank Kat Duffy-Buxton for agreeing to participate and inviting Grace and Dee Dee to this conversation. I have worked closely with Kat over the years, and particularly on the GMO labeling campaign, which I'll have a question for Grace in a moment. But for anybody who doesn't know, Kat, she's a dynamite field organizer, dynamite educator. Get to know her, and she had, unfortunately, to take care of a parent. So I always remind myself that your personal family needs comes first, then always all this other stuff that we're working on. So just remember that. So, but just other issues is next week we're actually doing an access to clean water. That's actually more with John Grobman, the Vermont Natural Resources Council, and Lynn Momo of the director of the Watersheds United, and basically on how we can make sure we have access to clean water. And then on August 5th, we just added on microtransit, and a lot of people don't know it, but basically it's difficult to get that last mile of transit. So we're going to be talking with Dan Jones, the Executive Director of Sustainable Montpelier, about the plans here in Montpelier. But Ross McDonald wants to actually expand it into other parts of the state and maybe even expand of how we go into the rural communities. So, but all of our conversations are promoted on our brand new website. If you go to sierraclub.org/Vermont, they'll have a recording. This one will be up sometime tomorrow, but we have a whole line of other conversations that we're doing, and we're trying to do them every Wednesday evening. Once we get into the fall, we'll bring it back to 7 p.m. But thank you all for joining us, and we can all stick around for after party conversations if we all have some more time.
Thanks so much, Rob. It's been great to be here.
Yeah, it has been really interesting and engaging, and I totally appreciate being here.